10 flatbed trucks, one town of 4,000 people, zero warning to the man who owned the garage they were driving toward. $2 billion is what Cordelia Ashby was worth the week she sent her entire personal fleet, 10 hand-built cars, each one insured for more than most people's houses, each one photographed for magazines that don't print prices because the number embarrasses the reader, rolling through the dark toward a single-bay garage with a chipped sign and a gravel lot barely large enough to hold them. 4 in the morning, 51 degrees, a town she had never heard of before that week and would not have been able to find on a map 2 days earlier, when she had laughed, actually laughed, a short, closed-mouth sound she made when she found something beneath her notice, at a photograph of that same chipped sign on someone's phone. Why a woman worth $2 billion would send her 10 rarest cars to a one-bay garage in a town she'd never heard of before that week is the kind of question that does not answer itself quietly. It insists. In a hotel suite 40 minutes away in Grand Rapids, Cordelia Ashby sat on the edge of a bed she hadn't slept in, still in yesterday's blazer, a phone in her hand with 11 missed calls from her own board chair lit up in a neat, accusing column. She did not return them. She watched the tracking dots on a fleet map crawl one by one toward a pin she'd had to zoom in 4 times to find. And when her chief of staff knocked and asked, with real fear under the professionalism, what she wanted said to the board, Cordelia said only, "Nothing yet." Not an explanation, not a denial. The kind of silence that costs a company more than a bad headline. Because silence from a woman who always has an answer is itself the headline. Stay with this one to the end. The driveway isn't the strangest part. The trucks came in low gear, engines idling down the single paved road that ran past the elementary school, the hardware store, and the diner with the flag out front, until they reached a lot with one bay door, a hand-lettered open sign turned to closed, and a rolling toolbox parked just inside like something standing guard. The drivers have been told almost nothing. An address, a time, a name. Emmett Vaughn. They unloaded in near silence, the kind of care usually reserved for surgery. 10 silhouettes gleaming faintly under sodium streetlight, engines ticking as they cooled, until the gravel lot of a one-bay garage in a town nobody important had ever driven through held more raw value than the town's entire tax base. By the time the sun came up gray over the tree line, the cars sat in 3 uneven rows, dew already beating on hoods that had never once been rained on, and a single light came on in the small house behind the garage. A kitchen light, warm and low, the kind that comes on not because someone heard 10 flatbed trucks in the night, but because a man with a good ear for engines had heard them anyway, and had a daughter who needed her oatmeal made regardless of what was sitting in his driveway. 3 days earlier, none of it would have made any sense to him either. 6:40 in the morning, and the kitchen smelled like brown sugar and the particular, faint metal tang that never quite left Emmett Vaughn's hands, no matter how long he scrubbed them the night before. He stood at the stove in a t-shirt gone soft from washing, stirring oatmeal on a flame turned low enough that it would never catch, while Josie sat at the table with her chin propped on one fist, watching him with the stillness of a child who had learned, somewhere along the way, that watching was its own kind of conversation. "You put the brown sugar in a circle," she said. Not a question. She had noticed it the way she noticed most things, once and precisely. "Cools faster on the edges," he said. "Middle stays hot longer. Circle spreads it even." She considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old auditing a parent's logic, then nodded, satisfied, and returned to her cereal box, reading the back for what he guessed was the 11th morning running. He set her bowl down, adjusted the backpack hanging off her chair, one strap always slipping, some manufacturing flaw he'd never bothered fixing, because fixing it would mean it stopped being the backpack she'd picked herself, cloud sticker peeling at one corner, and pulled it higher onto the chair back so it wouldn't slide to the floor before she was ready for it. Before he left the kitchen to shower, he did what he did most mornings without deciding to. He crossed to the rolling toolbox against the far wall, cracked the lid an inch, and looked at what lived folded in the top tray beneath a rag that had once been a shop towel and was now simply the thing that covered it. A sheet of drafting vellum, soft at the folds from 20 years of handling, one corner torn clean off long before he'd owned it long enough to matter. Pencil lines underneath, geometry only he could still read at a glance. Angles, offsets, a suspension mount drawn by his own hand in a life he didn't discuss. He didn't unfold it all the way. He never did in the mornings. He just confirmed it was there, the way another man might touch his own pulse without meaning to, and close the lid. Renata used to tease him about it, back when there was a Renata to do the teasing. Not unkindly, just with the exactness she brought to everything. The exactness Josie now carried in her own quiet way. She used to say he built cars the way other men wrote letters they never sent, with everything true in them and no intention anyone else would ever read it. He hadn't opened that drawing all the way in longer than he liked to count. 4 years almost exactly since the house had gone quiet in the particular way a house goes quiet when an illness finally wins after a long, patient fight. And he had learned to carry what he carried without setting it down where Josie could see the weight of it. He drove her to school with the windows cracked, despite the cold, because she liked the sound of tires on the wet road better than the radio. And he walked her only as far as the low fence, because she'd made it clear at 7 that self-sufficiency began at the gate. Then he doubled back through town, past the diner, past the hardware store, and pulled into the gravel lot of Vaughn's garage. One bay, hand-lettered sign, chipped where a delivery truck had clipped it 2 winters back, and he'd never gotten around to touching up the paint. He flipped the sign to open, propped the bay door, and stood for a moment in the cold smell of solvent and old rubber before the first customer of the day, a woman with a minivan and a check engine light, pulled in at 8:15 sharp. It was, by any measure that mattered to the town, an ordinary Tuesday. Nobody in it yet knew it wouldn't stay that way. The convoy hadn't been supposed to stop anywhere near Vaughn's garage. It had been routed, planned, and rehearsed for a press tour meant to showcase 6 of Ashby Performance Motori's newest builds, rolling from Grand Rapids to a dealership 2 hours north. Cameras trailing in a chase van, drone footage already storyboarded for the launch reel. What it had not been rehearsed for was the 3rd car in line developing a shudder at 60 miles an hour that no amount of throttle modulation would smooth out, followed 9 minutes later by the 6th car doing the exact same thing, in the exact same place in the gearbox, as though the road itself had reached up and found the flaw. Marion Pruitt, Ashby's lead chassis engineer, was out of her own car and crouched at the wheel well before the convoy had fully stopped on the shoulder, running her hands along the suspension arm with the practiced worry of someone who had personally signed off on every torque spec involved. "Same signature," she said, mostly to herself, phone already out, already dialing the shop 2 hours north. "Flatbed, both of them. We are not driving these in on a vibration we can't explain." Cordelia Ashby stood apart from the rest, arms crossed over a Blazer that had cost more than the minivan idling at a garage she didn't yet know existed, watching the scene with the flat irritation of someone whose calendar had just been rewritten by machinery she'd built her name on. She checked her watch. It was a habit her staff had learned to read like weather. When Cordelia Ashby looked at her wrist mid-sentence, the sentence, and often the person speaking it, had already stopped mattering to her. 2 hours, she repeated, tasting the number like something gone bad. "We have media on this road in 90 minutes, Marion." Then we tow to the dealership and reschedule the segment. "We don't have 2 hours for a tow truck to find us, load 6 cars, and drive them past the exact reporters we invited to watch this launch." Cordelia's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. "Find something closer." It was one of the drivers, a local hire who'd grown up 40 minutes from where they'd broken down, who mentioned the one bay place in town, the guy who'd fixed his uncle's truck twice for less than the dealership charged for a diagnostic. Marion looked skeptical. Cordelia looked at the man's phone, at a photograph someone had pulled up of a chipped hand-lettered sign reading Vaughn's Garage, gravel lot, one bay, and made the short, closed-mouth sound that passed, in her, for genuine amusement. "That," she said, "is where we're taking a car worth more than his entire town." Nobody laughed with her, exactly, but nobody corrected her either, which in a company built entirely around Cordelia Ashby's instincts amounted to the same thing. Marion's jaw tightened. She had built her career on being the most careful person in any given room, and the idea of trusting two flagship builds to an unknown one-bay shop sat wrong in a way she couldn't yet name a reason for. But the cameras were coming, the schedule was bleeding minutes, and she had learned that arguing with Cordelia mid-decision cost more than losing the argument outright. They arrived at Vaughn's garage in a slow-rolling procession that looked, from the diner window across the road, like a parade nobody had been told about. 6 pristine vehicles trailing 2 flatbeds, a chase van, and a scatter of press vehicles pulling in behind them onto gravel meant for pickup trucks and the occasional minivan. Emmett came out wiping his hands on a rag, took in the scene with the same unhurried attention he gave a stalling engine, and said nothing, which Cordelia seemed to find almost as amusing as the sign had been. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, reading his name off the sign rather than asking it, stepping out of her car onto gravel in shoes that had never touched gravel before. "We have a vibration issue in 2 vehicles. I understand you fix minivans." A pause, timed for the small audience now assembling with phones half raised. "This is somewhat past that, I imagine, but we're short on options at the moment, so—" She gestured at the garage, the single bay, the chipped sign. "Here we are." Marion, standing a step behind her, did not smile. Emmett didn't either, though something in his eyes moved the way still water moves when a stone breaks the surface a long way off. Not offense, not quite anything Cordelia's staff could name, before he simply said, "Pull the 3rd car in first. I'll need the bay clear of everyone who isn't holding a wrench." "On the record, if you don't mind," Cordelia added, nodding faintly toward the nearest camera, already composing, in her mind, the charming anecdote this would make once the car was fixed by someone competent 40 minutes from now. Marion had the diagnostic laptop out of the chase van before the 3rd car had fully stopped rolling into the bay, cables already half uncoiled, the practiced motion of someone who trusted instrumentation over instinct because instrumentation didn't have off days. "I'll get you the fault codes," she told Emmett, angling the screen so he could see the columns of data scrolling past. "Torque readings, sensor logs, everything from the last 400 miles. Should narrow it down fast." Emmett looked at the screen for exactly as long as politeness required, then didn't look at it again. He crouched instead at the front wheel well, laid his palm flat against the chassis rail just behind the mount, and went still in a way that made the 2 nearest cameramen exchange a glance over their viewfinders. The stillness of a man listening to something nobody else in the bay could hear. "You want me to rev it?" the driver asked, half a joke, mostly nerves. "Idle's fine," Emmett said. "Just idle." Marion frowned at her screen, then at him, then back at her screen, the fault code scrolling past in amber text that told her everything except what she actually needed to know. The logs show an intermittent resonance starting around 58 miles an hour. Could be a wheel balance issue, could be a bushing. It's not the wheel. Emmett's hand hadn't moved. His head had tilted, a half inch, the way a man leans toward a voice he's straining to catch across a noisy room. "Balance issues buzz. This one's got a pause in it. Little hitch, then it catches up with itself." One of the reporters, young, filming on her phone from just outside the bay door, murmured something to the cameraman beside her that neither of them bothered to lower their voice enough to hide. Something about small-town mechanics and big words for simple problems. A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the small crowd gathered on the gravel, the specific amusement of people watching someone perform competence rather than possess it. Cordelia, arms still crossed by her car door, checked her watch once, said nothing, and let her expression do the talking her schedule didn't have time for. Emmett didn't react to any of it. He reached into the wheel well and set 2 fingers against the mount itself, feeling for a rhythm underneath the idle that had nothing to do with the engine and everything to do with the metal holding it in place. There was a pattern to it, a specific, patient give and catch, the vibration equivalent of a limp that struck something in him older than the morning, older than the last 11 years. He'd felt this exact hitch before, in a testing bay a long way from here, under fluorescent lights that had nothing to do with this gravel lot, on a mount he had drawn the tolerances for himself, back when his name still appeared on things. "Torque wrench," he said, standing, not raising his voice, not needing to. Half-inch drive. And somebody find me the actual mount spec on this car. Not the shop manual number, the engineering number. Marion blinked. The engineering number isn't public. That's internal documentation. I know, Emmett said, and something in the flatness of it made her stop typing entirely, though she couldn't have said why, not yet, not with a fault code screen still glowing amber in her hands, and a crowd behind her already composing the joke they'd tell about this later. The mechanic in the coveralls who talked about tolerances he had no earthly reason to know. 20 minutes. That was the whole of it, start to finish, timed later by 3 separate phones, because 3 separate people in that gravel lot had the presence of mind to check. Emmett worked without hurry and without hesitation. The 2 states most people assume can't coexist in the same pair of hands. He pulled a mount, turned it once under the shop light, and set it back with a torque value dialed to a number that made Marion glance up sharply from her own reference sheet. "That's outside spec," she said. "Our spec has it 4 foot-pounds higher." "Your spec's wrong," Emmett said, without heat, the way a man corrects a typo. "It's been wrong for 2 years. Start it." The driver started it. 58 miles an hour wasn't achievable in a gravel lot. But Marion ran the diagnostic idle load simulation instead, the one she used for exactly this kind of doubt, and watched the amber trace on her screen that had shown a resonant spike an hour earlier lie flat and unremarkable. The way a heartbeat looks on a monitor once whatever had been wrong with it stops being wrong. Nobody in the lot said anything for a moment. Even the reporter who'd murmured her joke about small-town mechanics had gone still. Phone lowered an inch without seeming to notice she'd done it. "How?" Marion said finally. Not really a question, more the sound a person makes when a floor they trusted turns out not to be load-bearing. "Did you know the spec was off by 4 foot-pounds? Nobody outside our engineering division has that number." Emmett wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his back pocket, unhurried, and walked to the rolling toolbox against the garage's back wall. Not the customer's car, not the crowd, just the toolbox, as though it were the only other thing in the lot that mattered. He opened the top tray, lifted the rag that covered what lived there, and unfolded. All the way this time, a sheet of drafting vellum gone soft at the folds. One corner torn clean off, pencil geometry beneath it that had waited a long time to be looked at by anyone besides him. "Because I wrote it," he said, and held the drawing out where Marion could see the title block, faded but legible. A drawing number, E114, and beneath it, in a hand she recognized instantly because she had trained on drawings descended from it without ever knowing the source, a name. Emmett Vaughn. A date 11 years gone. Marion's mouth opened and produced no sound for a full 3 seconds, which felt to everyone watching considerably longer. "This is the platform," she said finally, quiet, almost to herself, running one finger along a dimension line without touching the paper itself, as though it might disintegrate. "This is the mount geometry under every car we've built since I started. I learned this drawing's descendants in my first month at Ashby. I didn't know it had an ancestor. I didn't know it had a person." Behind her, the crowd that had been amused 20 minutes ago had gone entirely silent, phones still raised out of habit rather than intention, the young reporter's mouth slightly open around a joke she would never finish telling anyone. Cordelia Ashby had not moved from beside her car door, one hand still resting on the frame, her watch unchecked. Her expression caught somewhere between the contempt she'd arrived with and something else she didn't yet have a name for. The particular stillness of a person watching a floor reveal a foundation she'd never known was underneath her. She said nothing. It was the first time in longer than her staff could remember that Cordelia Ashby had let a silence sit that long without filling it herself. The story did not stay in the gravel lot. Within 2 days, a shaky phone video of Marion Pruitt saying "I didn't know it had a person" had migrated from a local news segment to enough shares that Ashby's communications team stopped calling it a scheduling failure and started calling it, privately, a problem. Cordelia herself refused 3 separate requests for comment, which her board read, correctly, as a woman deciding how much of the truth she was willing to survive telling. Then, on the fourth day, before any of it had settled, the failure came back. This time not on a public road with cameras trailing, but on the factory floor in Turin, in a batch of 7 cars that had never left the building, never been driven, never touched the same road as the ones that broke down outside Emmett's garage. The same hitch, the same 4 foot-pound gap between the shop spec and whatever Emmett had specified 11 years earlier. 7 cars, sealed under factory lighting, failing a test they should have passed by design, 3 days before Ashby Performance Motori's flagship launch event, and 16 days before a shareholder vote meant to open the company to public investment for the first time in its history. Wallace Odell called it a bad coincidence when Marion first phoned him. Retired 11 years, but still sharp enough to remember the geometry of every drawing he'd ever signed off, including the ones with Emmett Vaughn's name at the bottom. By the time she called back an hour later with the Turin numbers, he'd stopped using the word coincidence entirely. The insurer moved faster than the board did. A letter arrived at Ashby's Grand Rapids headquarters. Not leaked, not implied, delivered by courier with a signature required, stating plainly that continued coverage on the entire model line was under review, pending an independent explanation for 2 now confirmed batches of identical structural failures, and that no coverage extension would be considered before the scheduled roadshow date, effectively meaning no roadshow at all if the question wasn't answered first. 19 days from the first flatbed truck to the shareholder vote, 4 of them already gone. Cordelia read the letter twice at her desk, alone, the door closed for the first time in longer than her assistant could recall, and then did something her own communications team hadn't drafted for her and hadn't recommended. She drove herself, without a car service, without a camera, to a 1-bay garage in a town she still couldn't have found without her phone's directions 2 weeks earlier. Emmett was under a minivan when she arrived and didn't come out right away, which she noted without the irritation it would have produced 2 weeks prior. When he finally did, wiping his hands on the same rag, she didn't offer an apology, and he didn't ask for one. "I need you to consult," she said. "Formally. Paid. Whatever number you want to attach to it." "I don't want a number," Emmett said. "Then what do you want?" He considered this the way he considered a stalling engine, not rushing toward an answer that would satisfy her sooner. "There's a batch of 7 cars in Turin that are going to end up in somebody's driveway eventually," he said finally. "Somebody's kid is going to be in one of them at 60 miles an hour when that mount lets go for real instead of just hitching. I'm not doing this for the company. I'm doing it so that doesn't happen." Cordelia looked at him for a long moment, the watch on her wrist unchecked, and said only, "That's fair," which was, for her, close to an apology after all. 10 of her flagship cars arrived at his garage that same week. The ones she could pull back fastest, the ones closest to the failure, sent not as a gesture but because Emmett had told her plainly that he needed the actual hardware in front of him, not reports about it, and she had, for the first time anyone on her staff could recall, simply done what she was told without negotiating the terms first. Wallace Odell drove up from downstate 2 days later, 71 years old, and moving like a man 20 years younger the moment he had a torque wrench back in his hand. And the 2 of them worked the access logs for Ashby's supplier contracts the way other men might work a crossword, methodically, cross-referencing, occasionally in silence for 20 minutes at a stretch. It was Wallace who found the supplier switch first, a mount vendor change dated 2 years back, buried under a part number that didn't match anything in the original design documentation. Approved by a signature that should have required an engineering review it never got. "Somebody swapped the mount supplier for something cheaper," Wallace said, tapping the screen with one blunt finger. "And then they had to make the paperwork agree with a decision that never should have been made in the first place." "Whose signature?" Emmett asked, though something in the set of his jaw suggested he already suspected. The sign-off belonged, on paper, to Emmett Vaughn, a signature dated 2 years after he'd left the company, on documents authorizing a tolerance change he had never seen and would never have approved, forged with just enough carelessness that it hadn't fooled Marion the moment she compared it against the original E114 title block letter by letter. What it had fooled, for 2 years, was everyone who trusted a name on a page more than they trusted the metal itself. Wallace pulled the facilities log next. The unglamorous kind nobody thinks to check until they have no other thread left to pull. Office supply requisitions, badge access records, missing item reports filed with building security. 2 years back, almost to the week the supplier contract changed, a signature stamp had been reported missing from an office on the 3rd floor of Ashby's Grand Rapids headquarters. Thaddeus Northcott's office, operations chief, the man who had personally championed the switch to a discount mount supplier as a cost-saving measure the board had approved without asking too many questions, because Northcott had a talent for making numbers look like diligence.
He didn't inherit a flaw, Wallace said quietly, setting the log down. He built one. And then he used your name to bury it, because your name was already gone from the building and couldn't argue back. Emmett didn't say anything for a while. He looked instead at the 10 cars parked in neat rows outside his one-bay garage, dew on the hoods again in the early light, worth more collectively than every house on his street combined, and thought, not with anger, something quieter than that, of how easily a name could be used once its owner had stopped being present to defend it. "Send it to the board," he said finally. "All of it. Let them see the stamp report next to the signature." The board meeting was held in Grand Rapids on the 17th day, 2 days before the vote, in a room with a long table and enough tension in it that even the coffee service seemed to move carefully. Thaddeus Northcott was not present. He had resigned that morning in a 2-line letter that admitted nothing and explained less, the moment his assistant had told him what documents were circulating among the directors. Nobody in the room mourned his absence. Cordelia stood at the head of the table, no notes in front of her, which her chief of staff would later say was the first time in company history she'd addressed the board without a deck. 2 years ago, this company approved a supplier change that put a cheaper part in a critical safety position, she said. And when the part failed exactly the way it should have been predicted to fail, someone inside this company forged a dead man's, a departed man's, signature to protect the decision instead of the customers who trusted us with their lives. I approved the cost-cutting initiative that made this possible, without asking the engineering questions I should have asked. That failure is mine before it is anyone else's. I built a company that valued a balance sheet over the tolerances underneath it. And I did that in full view of everyone in this room, and none of us stopped to ask who had actually built what we were selling. She turned to Emmett, seated near the far end of the table in the same canvas jacket he wore in the garage, sleeves rolled twice, the small grease-darkened patch on his left cuff visible under the conference room lights in a way that made it look less like wear and more like a badge nobody else in the room had earned the right to wear. "I'm offering you the chief engineer position," she said. "Full title, full authority over the platform you designed, and a settlement figure large enough that you'd never need the garage again, if you didn't want it." She named the number. It was not small. Several board members exchanged glances that suggested it was, if anything, conservative, given what Emmett had just saved them. Emmett was quiet long enough that Wallace, seated beside him, recognized the particular stillness of a man deciding not what to say, but how little of it he needed. "I don't want the title," Emmett said finally, "and I don't need the money enough to take it for the reason you're offering it." He looked around the table, not performing for it, simply speaking to the room the way he'd have spoken to a single customer with a stalling engine. "I want 2 things. Put my name back on the original patent filing, where it should have been 11 years ago. And fund an apprentice program, real one, paid, not a marketing line, so the next person who can hear what's wrong with a mount before a machine tells them doesn't have to leave a company to be believed." Nobody at the table laughed this time. Nobody checked a watch. Afterward, in the hallway outside, with the board still murmuring behind the closed door, Wallace fell into step beside him and said, "You could have taken the title, Emmett. Nobody would have blamed you." "I know," Emmett said. "So why didn't you?" Emmett thought about it, the way he thought about most things, slowly and only once, arriving at an answer he'd apparently already had ready without knowing it. "Renata used to say I built cars the way other men wrote letters they never sent," he said. "Everything true in them. Nobody meant to read it." He looked back once at the closed boardroom door, at the muffled sound of a company deciding,
for the first time in a long while, to tell the truth about itself. I already sent mine, 11 years ago. I don't need anybody to open it now for it to have been worth writing. Wallace didn't answer that, because there wasn't an answer that would have improved on it, and the two of them walked out into a Grand Rapids evening that felt, for the first time in 19 days, like an ordinary one.
3 months later, the recall was closed out clean. Every affected mount replaced under a corrected spec that bore, in the engineering documentation now filed properly, Emmett Vaughn's original number and his restored name beside it. The IPO roadshow, delayed but not abandoned, went forward on schedule with an unusual opening line in the investor materials. A full account of the failure, the correction, and the man who found both, printed plainly rather than buried, because Cordelia Ashby had insisted, over her own communications team's objections, that the truth made a better opening pitch than a curated one ever could. The shares opened strong. Nobody in the press called it a scheduling failure. Emmett didn't attend the opening bell. He was that morning exactly where he'd been most mornings of his life since the garage first opened under his name. Standing at the stove with the oatmeal on a low flame, brown sugar stirred into a careful circle. Josie at the table with her chin on her fist, reading the back of a cereal box she'd read 40 times before and would read again tomorrow simply because it was hers. "Are the fast cars gone for good now?" she asked, the way she asked most things, once and precisely. "They went back where they belong," Emmett said. "Ours was never a place for keeping them, just fixing them." She considered that with the same gravity she brought to backpack straps and brown sugar circles, then reached into her folder and pulled out a piece of paper she'd been saving for exactly this moment, the way she saved most things worth showing him. 10 small cars, crayon drawn in a careless, joyful row, parked outside a square building with a single door that could only have been the garage. A stick figure with tools in one hand standing beside it. "For the toolbox," she said. Not a question. She had already decided. That evening, after the shop had closed and the sign had been flipped from open to closed for the day, Emmett crossed to the rolling toolbox against the back wall and lifted the lid all the way, further than he had in longer than he liked to count. The drawing was there, drafting vellum soft at every fold, the torn corner mended now with a careful strip of clear tape that Marion had insisted on adding herself, the same afternoon she'd filed the corrected patent paperwork, saying only that a document that important shouldn't be left to keep tearing on its own. Beside it, he laid Josie's drawing, 10 small cars in a crooked crayon row, and closed the lid over both of them together. The torn history and the new one, resting in the same small space they'd always shared without either of them knowing it. Outside, the light was going the particular gray-gold color it goes at dusk in that part of the country. Gravel lot empty except for the one truck that had always been there. Town quiet in the way small towns are quiet when nothing especially remarkable is happening in them anymore. Emmett rolled the bay door down, unhurried, the same motion he'd made 1,000 evenings before this one and would make 1,000 evenings after. And somewhere behind him, in a kitchen that smelled faintly of brown sugar, a girl who noticed things once and precisely was already asleep, certain, without needing to be told, that her father would be there in the morning to make the oatmeal in a circle. If you believe quiet, patient work deserves to be seen before the applause ever starts, let us know where you're watching from.